Hi, my name is Steve New, and welcome to my channel, Steve's Film Vault. This channel will be dedicated to everything DSLR camera, from photography, including videography, and beyond. I've been teaching video and photography at the prestigious East Career and Technical Academy in Las Vegas, Nevada for the last 10 years plus. And I'm going to be bringing that knowledge to you in a manner that is going to be easy to understand. So whether you know anything about the camera, how it works, what all those different buzzers and knobs do, I'm going to bring it to you in a manner that should be very easy for you to comprehend. This episode is all about the aperture. So go ahead and flip your camera to the AV or whatever it is on your camera for the aperture setting, priority setting, and we're going to move on from here. The number one problem that most people have in understanding the aperture is the numbers can be very confusing. You have a small number like the number 4 or 3.5, and it goes up to 22 and some cameras beyond. And you'd think a small number means a small aperture and a large number means a large aperture, but what you quickly discover, it's just the opposite. Well, the key to it all, the secret is, it is a fraction that we're dealing with. It's called an f-stop, so it's an f over that number. So f over 4, think of it as the fraction 1/4. f over 22, think of it as the fraction 1/22. 1/4 is larger than 1/22, and it all has to do with the focal length of the camera. If you have a variable focal length camera like this one, where I have a 18 to 55 millimeter zoom, that's the focal length. So it's actually changing the focal length from 18 millimeters all the way up to 55. I might also put on my telephoto lens, which will take it all the way out to 200-300, however long your focal length is. So it's that focal length over the amount of light that you want let into the camera. So say for instance an f4 means that you're allowing in roughly 1/4 of the available light in the room into the camera. If you had a really expensive lens that would go down to an f1.4, that's virtually letting in almost all available light that is in that room. Where an f22 closes down that opening to where only like 1/22 of the available light is actually coming into the cameras, much less light. So it's either a large opening, which is like an f4, f3.5, all the way down to a very small opening, which would be the f22. Now, as you adjust your f-stops, as you adjust that aperture, that means that the camera either is going to make the decision for you, or you need to understand how to adjust other factors to allow that image to balance to give you a good image. Remember, we talked about that in the very first episode, where you have the aperture, the shutter speed, and the sensitivity of the lens that we're basically dealing with here. So if you have a very large opening, that means that you're going to need to have less sensitivity to the sensor, or a much faster shutter speed to only allow in a certain amount of light. So just remember, larger the aperture, less sensitive of the sensor, faster shutter speed. Smaller the aperture, more sensitive of the sensor, and or a slower shutter speed. So those are kind of the way we're balancing it out, but we are going to stick with aperture for right now. One other thing with the aperture is that the larger the aperture, we refer to it as the shallower depth of field. The smaller the aperture, the longer depth of field. Think of it as the iris in your eye. Your eye's iris is just like the aperture of the camera. If you've ever been to the doctor and they put those drops in to have your eyes dilate nice and big, you probably discovered that it's really hard to read. Why? Because your ability to focus has been taken away, where the lens in your eye cannot quite adjust enough to make the image on the page to focus in your eye. So what basically then will happen is you need to either wait for that to dilate down or add more light to the page to hopefully allow your eye to see better. Same thing trying to read at night. When you're reading at night, your eyes dilate, it's harder to read the page. Ever been in a dark restaurant, try to read the menu? So what does everyone do? They pull out their phones, turn on the light, and they're using a flashlight to try to read the menu. The more light on the page, once again, bringing more light into that dilated eye is going to allow you to focus a little bit easier on the page. Same thing happens with the camera. Think of it as two intersecting lines. With the diagram that I have right now, if you have a very shallow intersecting line, that means if the tolerance of focus is so much to either side as far as how far those lines are apart, you have a much wider range of focus when those angles are shallow. When those angles are steep, meaning a larger aperture, that means that area between tolerance of focus has been drastically reduced. So the larger the aperture, an f4 setting will allow you to have a very shallow depth of field, which means your object is going to be sharp focus, but everything in front and everything behind is going to be thrown out of focus. If you have a very shallow angle, in other words, a very small aperture, f22, you are going to have everything in focus, both before your subject and everything behind. So depending on the image you're trying to capture, if you want that really artsy looking image where that person is in sharp focus and everything else is blurred behind them, you need to go with a large aperture and then allow for the shutter speed and the sensitivity of the camera to make the adjustment to get that image. I have a series of photos that I'm showing you right now that is basically showing you the same setup but with different apertures, and I'll have the apertures listed below as well. So that is going to help you understand what I want to get by adjusting that aperture for artistic sake. Now, a couple of other tricks you're going to want to do is the further your background is away from your subject, the better you're going to be able to blur that background. I'm fairly close to that fish tank behind me. If I was sitting right next to it, it would be really hard to blur that fish tank. But if I am further away from it, it's going to be a lot easier to blur that image behind me. So remember, the distance you have between subjects will help that out tremendously. Now, as you look at your camera, we do have a number of settings. The aperture preferred mode is what we're going to be playing with. If you go to full manual, you're going to need to have a better understanding of those other settings. So let's hold off a few more weeks before we go to that. We're going to keep it to the aperture preferred, and we'll go ahead and experiment this week. So have fun with that, play with it. That's basically my lesson today about aperture. And hope you enjoyed this. Now remember, if you did like this episode, give me a thumbs up. If you really like it, don't forget to hit the subscribe button. I have so much coming your way over the next weeks and months to come. I will be laying out pretty much my entire photography curriculum to this YouTube channel. So please enjoy, like, and subscribe, and keep on shooting. We'll see you next time.